The next morning, we made our way to the outskirts of town, where the old church stood like a forgotten monument to a time long past. The stone structure was crumbling, the stained glass windows shattered, and the tall spire was barely standing, as if the building itself was slowly giving up on its existence. The air around it felt different, thicker, somehow, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. "Are you sure about this?" Lexi asked, her voice quieter than usual. She had grown up with the rumors after all, but there was something more in her tone now, fear. Real fear. I nodded, though I could feel my own unease settling in. "We'll take a look around, get the story, and leave." Simple. We entered the churchyard, the overgrown grass crunching beneath our feet. The door to the church creaked open with a groan, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the remnants of candles and old, tattered pews littered the floor. But what caught my attention was the altar. There was something wrong about it. It didn't seem like any normal altar. It had an eerie aura around it, as if something had been used here recently. I took a few steps forward, the floorboards creaking underfoot. "This place is falling apart. Nothing here looks like it's been touched in years," I said, but my voice felt hollow in the space, as if the building itself was swallowing my words. "That's the thing, Henry," Lexi said, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the church. "It looks abandoned, but it's never completely empty. People come here, at night. Who would come to a place like this at night?" I asked, my skepticism still strong, though it was becoming harder to ignore the strange feeling in the air. Before Lexi could answer, a low, unsettling sound filled the room. It was a faint hum, almost like the sound of wind through a narrow tunnel. But there was no wind. The church was sealed tight, and yet the hum grew louder, the pitch shifting in strange patterns, like a siren's call. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the far wall, too quick to be a trick of the light. It seemed to flicker, and in that moment, I felt the temperature drop, a cold that seeped into my bones. Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling despite myself. Lexi's face had gone pale, her hand trembling as she reached for my arm. "It's here. It's really here." And then, from the shadows, it emerged. The Goliath. It wasn't quite animal, not entirely, but it had the shape of a tall, gaunt figure of tiger, its body shifting in and out of visibility, like a silhouette made of smoke and shadow. Its face was featureless, a blank mask of nothingness, but somehow, I knew it was staring directly at us. A cold, malevolent presence filled the air, and the hum grew louder, now almost deafening. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. Lexi grabbed my sleeve, pulling me back toward the door. "We need to go now," she shouted. But the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls, and I realized we were trapped. Panic clawed at me, but my feet felt frozen to the floor, as if the church itself was holding me in place. The Goliath moved closer, its elongated paws stretching toward us. I could feel it probing my mind, like it was searching for something, some weakness. And then I heard it whispers, soft at first, then growing louder. I shook my head, trying to clear the overwhelming fog that was descending on my mind. "It's not real," I muttered to myself. "It's not real." But Alexi's voice was barely a whisper now, tinged with desperation. "Henry, it's real. It's all real." The figure seemed to loom closer, the air around it distorting, as if it was bending reality itself. The church around us flickered in and out of focus. One moment we were inside, the next we were outside, standing in a twisted version of the churchyard where the grass grew too tall, and the sky was dark with swirling clouds. I tried to reach for Lexi, but she was no longer standing beside me. Instead, I saw her in the distance, a small figure trapped in a web of darkness, her face twisted in terror. "Henry," her voice came, echoing all around me. "Help me." I tried to run, but my seat wouldn't move. The air was thick with dread, and the shadows closed in from all sides. The Goliath's form dissolved into mist, reappearing in front of me, its voice a low, almost musical hum. "Fear is what I weave," it said. "Fear is what sustains me." I wanted to scream, to fight back, but the words wouldn't come. The illusions were getting stronger, and I felt my grip on reality slipping. I couldn't breathe. The pressure in my chest was suffocating, as if the church itself was closing in on me. Every shadow, every flicker of light seemed to twist into something monstrous. I reached out for Lexi, but she was just a distant blur, as if she was miles away despite standing only a few feet from me. Her voice echoed through the chaos, strained and desperate. "Henry, you have to listen to me. You have to stop it before it's too late." I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead. My mind was clouded, thoughts racing, but none making sense. I needed to shake. I needed to do something. But every time I focused on one thing, it shifted, became something else. And then I heard the hum again. The same eerie sound that had filled the church when we first walked in. It was no longer a hum, though. It was a voice speaking directly into my mind, so cold and piercing that it felt like it was tearing through me. "You are weak. You cannot escape. You belong here in the web I spun." The Goliath. The name echoed in my mind like a chant, and for a moment, I could see its form clearer now. It was not just a creature of darkness. It was something older, something born of pain and loss, a force of nature twisted by the torment of its past. I remembered what Lexi had said about the town's history, about the church and the people who came here, about the rumors of souls trapped in the church, of a creature that fed on fear. Was the Goliath one of those souls? Was it a person once before it became this thing? "Lexi," I shouted, forcing my voice through the pressure in my throat. She didn't respond. I could barely see her anymore, lost in the swirling blackness. "Where are you?" Her voice came again, faint, distorted by the echoing hall. "It wants you, Henry. It's taking you. You have to believe me." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the cacophony of the voice inside my head, but it was no use. The Goliath's presence filled every corner of the church, every inch of the space, wrapping around me like an invisible web, pulling me closer and closer to the center. I had to fight it, but how? I remembered the rumors, the legends that Lexi had told me about the church, the stories of a woman who had once lived in Westwich, a young girl named Eliza. She had been the last to seek refuge in the church before it was abandoned. The whispers said she had been in love with a man who had betrayed her, leaving her brokenhearted and desperate. Eliza, so desperate, had hung herself in the very church I stood in now. But that wasn't the whole story. Eliza had died there. Yes, but not before leaving something behind, a curse. The Goliath wasn't just a creature of shadow. It was her spirit, twisted by anger and betrayal, a manifestation of all her pain. And it had been feeding on the fear of anyone who dared to step foot in this forsaken place. I opened my eyes, staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of the shifting shapes. I had to stop it. But how? The answer came, clear as day. "Lexi," I shouted again, my voice sharp with urgency. "The altar. It's tied to the curse, isn't it? We have to destroy it." But no answer came. Lexi was nowhere in sight, her figure swallowed by the shadows. But I could feel her, just beyond reach, just like the altar. I had to act fast, or the Goliath would pull us both into its eternal grasp. I pushed forward, forcing my feet to move, my body shaking with every step. The altar was at the center of the room, just beyond the darkness. It pulsed with a sickening energy, a glow that wasn't light, but the absence of it. As I approached, I could hear the whispers again, louder this time. They weren't just coming from the creature. They were coming from the altar, from the very stones beneath my feet. I reached out, my hand trembling as it hovered over the cold stone. The hum in the air grew louder, almost deafening. It was the sound of grief, of loss, of centuries of pain. And I realized in that moment that the creature, the Goliath, wasn't just feeding on fear. It was feeding on its own sorrow, trapped in an endless loop of agony, never able to break free. It was a prison, not just for the souls of the dead, but for its own torment. I needed to break the cycle. I needed to free it from its own misery. But how could I do that? How could I stop something that had been festering for so long? I took a deep breath, pushing aside the terror that gripped me, focusing on the story Lexi had told me. The legend of Eliza. The curse. It wasn't just a story, it was a warning. The key to breaking the curse was forgiveness. To end the Goliath's torment, I had to forgive. But who could forgive such a thing? A broken heart? A betrayal that led to death? Then I realized it wasn't my forgiveness that would end it. It was Eliza's. She had to forgive herself. But how can I make that happen? How could I bring peace to a soul that had been twisted by so much rage and sorrow? I closed my eyes, and in that moment, I saw a flicker of hope. It was faint, barely there, but it was enough. I reached deep into the darkness, into the heart of the church, and I whispered the only thing that came to mind. I forgive you. The moment the words left my lips, the world around me seemed to shift. The hum stopped, the whispers died, and the shadows receded. When I opened my eyes, the church was still dark, but the oppressive weight had lifted. The coldness was gone. The air felt lighter, as if the curse had been lifted. Lexi appeared beside me, her face pale but relieved. "Tenry," she breathed, her voice trembling. Did you do it?" I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure. All I knew was that the darkness had lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe again. The Goliath was gone. We left the church together, walking into the daylight. The town of Westwich felt different somehow, as if the air itself had changed. The church, though still standing, no longer felt like a place of torment. The shadows had receded, and I had a sense that the curse, whatever it had been, had finally been broken. But even now, as I write this, I'm not sure if it was all just a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and fear, or if what we faced in that church was real. But one thing I know for sure is that something changed in that place. Something deep and ancient, something tied to the town's history. The days following our departure from the church were strange. Like the town of Westwich was a different place altogether. At first, I thought it was just the weight of the experience pressing on my mind, making everything seem off. But as we walked through the town, something felt fundamentally different. The houses seemed quieter, the trees less imposing, the roads more worn and welcoming. It was almost as if the place had exhaled a breath it didn't know it was holding. But every time I looked back toward the church, no longer the dark and brooding place we had left behind, but something calmer, more neutral, it still tugged at me. And so did the memory of the Goliath. Do you think it's really gone? I asked Lexi one evening as we sat on the porch of her small house, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The shadows were lengthening, but the oppressive air that had once hovered over the town was absent. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice low. "I want to believe it is. But the stories," she trailed off, looking out toward the church, which was barely visible in the distance. "I heard things, Henry, things I can't explain. Sometimes I wonder if we did enough to stop it." I shook my head, trying to brush off the feeling that still clung to me like an old wound. We did what we had to do. The curse is broken. It has to be. But even as I said the words, doubt gnawed at me. Could it really be over? Could something so powerful, so ancient, be vanquished so easily? Or was the Goliath merely waiting for the next unwitting soul to wander too close? 2 weeks later, I found myself back at the church, standing in the same place where it had all started. I hadn't planned on returning. Not really. But something had drawn me here, something I couldn't explain. It was like an itch at the back of my mind, one that can only be scratched by stepping back into the very heart of the darkness. I approached the church cautiously, the door creaking open with a reluctant groan. I half expected the overwhelming sensation of dread to hit me again, but it didn't. It was different now, quieter. Still, something lingered. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing against the stone floor. The altar was still there, untouched, but somehow less imposing. I moved closer, feeling an odd sense of reverence, but also an eerie calm. And that's when I saw it. A shadow, small, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably there. shifting in the corner of the room. I froze. I could feel the air change, as if the church had sensed my presence. Waking from a long slumber, a whisper fluttered in my ear, so faint I thought I imagined it. "Come closer." My breath caught in my throat. The voice was different now, softer, less menacing. It wasn't a Goliath's usual hum. This was something else, something more subtle, but still enough to make my skin crawl. "Lexi," I called out, but my voice felt strange in the church, hollow, as if it didn't quite belong. I turned around, expecting to see her standing at the door, but no one was there. It was just me alone in the dark. I took a hesitant step forward, drawn to the altar, as if some invisible force was pushing me. The shadow flickered again, and this time, I could swear I saw a figure. A woman, tall and thin, dressed in tattered white. She was standing by the altar, her face obscured by long, matted hair. Her presence filled the room, heavy and suffocating, yet strangely familiar. "You're still here," I whispered, as the reality of the situation settled in. I didn't know what I was expecting, but the voice that answered was not what I anticipated. "You think it's over, but the thread still binds us. Henry Harris. The curse has not been undone." The voice wasn't cruel, nor was it angry. It was weary, and something else, a sense of sadness that seemed to bleed from the walls of the church. I took another step closer, but the figure didn't move, only stared at me with eyes I couldn't see. "So are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't respond right away, and for a moment, all I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke again. "I was once Eliza, but I am something more now." The words hit me like a blow to the chest. Eliza, the girl from the legends. The one whose sorrow had turned into a curse. The one whose grief had twisted into the Goliath. "You were the Goliath?" I asked, barely able to process it. "But you're not what I expected. You don't seem angry anymore." Her form seemed to shimmer in the dim light, and her voice grew faint. Anger. Anger was all I had left, but that is not who I am now. That was the creature you faced, the one who haunted the church. But I am not that. I was on the verge of asking more when the floor beneath me groaned, and the altar trembled, as if reacting to her words. I've been bound to this place for so long. Tinry, my torment never ceased. Not until you spoke the words of forgiveness. Her form flickered, a silhouette of someone who had once lived, but now existed only in whispers and shadows. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. Then, is it really over? Has the curse been broken? The woman, Eliza, did not immediately answer. Instead, her form began to shift, slowly dissolving into the shadows around her. As she faded, I could hear her voice, soft and fragile. "The curse was never mine to undo. It was always yours." And then she was gone. I stood in the church for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to change, for some sign that this had all been real. But nothing happened. The shadows receded, and the oppressive weight lifted. I walked back out of the church, blinking against the daylight. The town of Westwich looked the same as it always had, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something I couldn't quite put into words. Lexi was waiting for me outside. When she saw me, her face softened with concern. "Henry, what happened in there?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. "You've been gone so long. Are you okay?" I nodded, but I didn't have the words to explain it. Not yet. I think it's finally over. But even as I said it, a part of me wasn't sure. A part of me wondered if Eliza's curse truly was broken, or if, in some way, it would always linger, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the next person to wander too close. I glanced back at the church one last time. It stood silent, no longer a looming presence, but still holding its secrets. And then, just as I turned to walk away, I thought I saw a flicker of movement. Barely perceptible, but unmistakable. A shadow just beyond the door waiting. But this time, it didn't feel like the thread I had once known. It was something softer, something at peace. Maybe Eliza had found it after all. Days passed, and with them, The unsettling calm that had settled over Westwich began to wear off. It was subtle at first, a soft sense of disquiet in the air, like a forgotten tune playing in the back of your mind. I tried to push it aside, telling myself that everything was fine. I had to believe that. After everything we had been through, after what I had witnessed at the church, I couldn't allow myself to dwell in fear any longer. But it wasn't long before I realized that some things couldn't simply be erased. I was at Lexi's house one afternoon when I felt it, a sharp, sudden sensation of being watched. It started like a flutter of cold air against the back of my neck, a prickling chill that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. But when I turned around, I saw the shadow again. It was only a flicker, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. The same dark figure, hovering just outside the window, its form barely defined but still recognizable. I couldn't breathe as I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. "Lexi," I hissed, rising to my feet. Lexi looked up from the book she was reading, a confused expression on her face. "What's wrong? Did you see that?" I gestured toward the window, but when she looked, the shadow was gone. Only the empty street remained. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "I didn't see anything." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I wanted to explain it to her, to tell her what I had seen, but the words felt too heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been haunting Westwich, whatever I had thought was over, was still here, lingering in the background, waiting for the right moment to strike again. "I'm not sure," I said, my voice trembling, "but I don't think it's finished. I think it's still out there." Lexi frowned, her expression a mixture of skepticism and worry. "Henry, you're not making sense. You've been through a lot. Maybe you're just imagining things." But I knew what I had seen. I wasn't imagining anything. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure who or what it was anymore. Was it Eliza? The Goliath? Or something else entirely? I couldn't say. I didn't even know if the creature that had once tormented us was really gone. I didn't know if anything was. The following week, things began to get stranger. People in town started talking about odd occurrences. Strange noises in the night. Shadows moving at the corners of their eyes. And then, one evening, a new face appeared in Westwich. A man named Tobias. He showed up at Lexi's door, claiming to be a historian researching local legends. He had a quiet, nervous air about him, and his eyes were always darting around, as if he expected someone or something was watching him. There was something off about him, but I couldn't quite place it. "Do you mind if I asked you a few questions about Westwich?" Tobias asked after a few minutes of small talk. His voice was steady, but tinged with an urgency I couldn't ignore. I've heard things about this place. About its history. About the church." Lexi exchanged a glance with me before nodding. "Sure, we got plenty of time." She motioned for him to sit down, and we all took a seat at the table.